This is the Martin film, and I'm going to go through it and point out several what I think are alterations to the film. Most of these alterations are the simple deletion of frames, though a couple of them are more sophisticated than that. As I went over in my last video, John Martin himself apparently said that the DCA version of his film didn't include much of the original of his film, and since the only version available is the DCA version, that's what I'm showing here, so we can assume that a lot of his original film has not been included here because he apparently said so. I consider that to be alteration 2, though it might not be alteration with the purpose of covering up the assassination, or what happened in the assassination. So I'm pointing out in this video what I think was done in order to hide details of what actually happened. Presumably the people who put the DCA film together wouldn't be doing that. They would just be removing material they didn't want in their film. So starting here, this is the presidential limousine as it's coming around the corner from Main onto Houston Street. And the first alteration I'm going to point out is the removal of a few frames as the car comes around the corner. As you can see, the car suddenly jumps ahead of where it was, and I've got a person circled there. I'm going to run that again so you can see. This is uncut by me. The car's coming around the corner, and then suddenly it's just further out ahead. So several frames are missing here. I don't think the cameraman stopped filming. He'd keep filming at this point. But frames have been removed, and I think I know the reason. I think it's because this guy I circled here had his hand up to his hat in a signal, and during the removed frames, he was taking his hand down. And if you could see that motion, you might think it's suspicious that this guy was doing something. He wasn't waving, he had his hand up on his hat. And here I've inserted the Alkins 4 photograph, and you can see that same man before he's brought his hand down. And this Alkins 4 photo was taken during the time of the missing frames in the Martin film. So because those frames are missing, you can't see this guy with his hand up there and him bringing it down. And the Alkins 4 photo itself was altered because you never see it in full frame. The right hand side is the part of it you always see, the part that appeared in newspapers on the day after the assassination. But the left hand side is almost never seen, but you can find it occasionally somewhere. But it's only when you put it together that you realize that that guy on the side of the road, who I think is Rip Robertson of the CIA, and I think standing beside him is Ted Shackley of the CIA, it's only when you see it together that you realize that guy is giving a signal and that Jackie also is giving a signal. But when you cut the picture in half, you don't notice that. And in the Martin film, I think these frames were removed so that you wouldn't notice that this guy's hand was coming down from his hat, because whoever was editing the film knew who he was, or knew that he was there for a purpose, and that purpose had to be hidden. And that's why these frames were removed from the Martin film. And now, continuing with the film, here you can see Jackie's hand comes down after she's given her signal. And here he's changed his position. The car is on Elm Street now, and this is after the shooting. People are moving towards the scene. There goes Bob Jackson, I think. And the next thing here is in the parking lot behind the pergola, and this here I've circled is Sheriff Decker. The official story says Decker is at Parkland Hospital, but I say he's here. And circled in green is Roger Craig. Now we're supposed to believe, according to the official story, that this is Roger Craig and Buddy Walters walking through the parking lot. But as I said, I think it's Decker. And I think Craig was inserted into this film because he had to be inserted into another film. into the Darnell film. And this is from the Darnell film, and the purpose of inserting Roger Craig into this is to hide Sheriff Decker's face. Because if you don't hide his face, you can see it's Sheriff Decker and not Buddy Walters, and you'd be able to see that Sheriff Decker is in Dealey Plaza when he's supposed to be at Parkland Hospital. I have a video about that. I'm not going to get further into that. But because Craig was inserted here into the Darnell film in order to hide Decker's face, he also has to appear here in the Martin film because these two films are showing the same scene but from different angles. So even though inserting Craig into the Martin film does not perform a conspiracy cover-up function, it still had to be done in order to make it consistent with the Darnell film. And here you can see Darnell as he's filming. Now, I don't see any suspicious editing issues in this part of the film and the rest of the film from the parking lot here. It's not until we get Amos Ewens supposedly on Sergeant Harkness's motorcycle. I'm very suspicious that this is not actually the scene from the day, because I think it's hard to explain here. I've got a video on it, but there were two black boy witnesses. One was an 11-year-old, one was a 15-year-old, and I think the 11-year-old got the ride on Harkness's motorcycle. But the 11-year-old, as you can see here, talking to Sergeant Harkness, is a rather small person, and on the motorcycle, to me, that looks like a larger person. I'm not certain about this, because maybe it is the smaller person, and just because of the positioning he looks larger, and this would be a somewhat sophisticated edit. I'm sure they could do it if they thought they had to. So I'm not sure about this one, but I'm suspicious that the 15-year-old was filmed later and inserted into this film so that he would look like a 15-year-old on the motorcycle rather than an 11-year-old. But as I said, I have a video on that. So, moving along now to in front of the Texas School Book Depository. I think this person here was inserted into the film after the fact, and that he wasn't really there on the day of the assassination. I'll have to give a short explanation of that. I also have a video on this, and it's all about Doorway Man. The original plan for the assassination cover-up was to photograph Billy Lovelady in the doorway prior to the assassination and to take his face from that photograph and paste it onto number 3 here. But for whatever reason they couldn't do that, and they pasted it onto number 2. Number 2 is Joe Molina, not Lee Harvey Oswald. And because they did that, that meant that the Billy Lovelady alibi photo had a different shirt than was planned for. The shirt they planned to use is the photograph you see, number 1, with Billy Lovelady wearing that shirt, and that's the same shirt or a very similar shirt to what number 3 is wearing. So the original plan was that Billy Lovelady was going to be said to be wearing that shirt seen in number 1, and that number 3 was wearing, but the plan changed, and therefore they have to have Billy Lovelady wearing a different shirt on the day of the assassination. So this other guy, number 4, was inserted into the Martin film. I don't think it's Billy Lovelady, actually, but it's somebody who looks enough like Billy Lovelady so that he could be mistaken for him. He was inserted into that film to prove, in quotation marks, that Billy Lovelady was wearing a shirt which could be said to be the shirt being worn by number 2. And I'm not going to try to explain it any more than that here, because I want this video has to be under 15 minutes. So I'm saying that this guy who's moving around, but not a whole lot, is actually not in the original film. And then moving along here, we have Charles Brem talking to people, and his son. And then the next The next edit involves this young man here and his encounter with a motorcycle officer. I think he's looking at the approaching motorcycle officers, and he accosts one of them, and that one of them comes over to talk to him, as it looks like this one in the green is veering off to the left here because he's responding probably to the boy shouting at him, and he's coming over to find out what it's all about. But then frames are removed, and it looks as though the motorcycle officer doesn't stop and just keeps riding by. But you can tell that the missing frames represent several seconds at least, because you can see this young man walking in front of the camera off to the right, and after the cut and the scene is over, you can see this young man again back over on the left. So enough time had to have passed here while that motorcycle officer was stopped at where the young boy is, presumably talking to the young boy. Enough time must have passed so that this young man in the red jacket could have walked back over to the left again, where we see him again when the camera pans over there. So the alteration here makes it look as though this motorcycle officer just kept riding by, when in reality he actually stopped and talked to that boy for at least several seconds. And notice the body language going on here with this older man, probably the boy's father, after the motorcyclist moves on. It looks to me as if the father is telling the boy to calm down and forget about it, something like that. The implication, I think, is that this boy was upset. Perhaps he was accusing this motorcycle officer of something, and the father realizes there's no point in continuing to be upset here, because who's going to believe the boy over this officer, at least not immediately in this situation. It looks like the father is trying to calm down the boy and say forget about it. So I think that something went on here, and that probably the film was altered to make it look as though nothing went on here. And perhaps the editors knew what it was. I don't know what it is for sure, because I don't know who that motorcycle officer is. And then, as the camera pans away over to the Texas School Book Depository, we see this guy here, and I think this is probably James Powell, the Army intelligence agent who supposedly took the Powell photo. And frames are removed. And then it suddenly picks up again, and we can see this guy again, and it looks like he's carrying a camera. He's holding something in front of him as if it's a camera, and I think perhaps the reason the frames are removed is because it's not a camera. I have a video about Powell and his photo. He had a walkie-talkie with him when he was in the Texas School Book Depository, and I think he wanted to make it look as though he had a camera. That's why he asked his co-workers to bring him a camera, as I've gone over in that other video. Well, I think probably the cutout frames show him obviously holding something not a camera, that is the walkie-talkie, and probably that's why those frames were removed, because he doesn't want people to know he had a walkie-talkie in Dealey Plaza on the day that the president was murdered. And then the last thing in the film that I used to think was an alteration, but now I know isn't, is this girl here. I used to think she was put in front of this officer, who is L.L. Hill, apparently. I'm not going to get into an explanation of that here, but I now know that I was wrong about that. There's a film taken from across the street that shows this girl walking there too while this car is coming by. So that is not an alteration. And, I could be wrong about anything I've said in this video too. It's hard to prove these things, except that where I said frames were removed, obviously they were. So it's harder to prove things have been inserted into the films, but it's easier to prove that frames have been removed. And I seem to be at the 15-minute limit, so those are the alterations in the Martin film.